Do you ever consider when filling large theaters that through unobvious ways you could be misguiding them?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I consider that all the time. I mean, I'll give you an example. So Carl Jung spent a lot of time analyzing Hitler, who, by the way, I've been compared to, so far unsuccessfully, thank God.
Why would he say, so far he's been compared to Hitler unsuccessfully? Is he implying that one day someone might compare him to Hitler with success? Also, why would he answer a question about possibly adversely affecting his adherents by invoking Hitler? Of course, he will deny that he's like Hitler, but who would feel the need to do that? Let alone hold the denial up as evidence that he's not harming anyone, as you will see him do in a video he called Jordan Peterson on the weight of his influence.
He said that Hitler embodied the collective unconscious of the German people. And I tried to take that apart. Now, Jung took that apart a lot. He laid out the following scenarios. So
Jung did not lay out the following scenarios. Rather, Peterson will say that in 1939, the Germans had their reasons for going to war, an argument he's been making since at least 1996. Peterson is not one to express empathy. As he writes in 12 Rules for Life, men have to toughen up, yet you will hear him express empathy for interwar Germany. Feel free to ask yourself why.
Of course, World War I, 1914 to 1918, was an absolutely dismal, bloody, horrific catastrophe. And Germany came out of that much bruised and battered with a generation of men who'd been brutalized by trench warfare. And so that's pretty damn rough.
Rough for who? The French or the Belgians? Britain and its empire? The Americans or the Russians? No, for the country that invaded France and Belgium and wouldn't admit to losing the war after it sued for peace. The poppy Peterson has on is camouflage.
And then the Versailles Treaty was foisted upon the Germans unwisely and subjected them to unbearable reparation costs.
The narrative is told from the perspective of the chief aggressor, not those who suffered because of German aggression.
And so the Germans felt that not only had they lost the war, which was a catastrophe.
Again, it took the Germans 6 months to admit they lost the war, and it wasn't long before they were blaming their defeat on the Jews, who, they lied, had betrayed the fatherland with a stab in the back.
And so the Germans felt that not only had they lost the war, which was a catastrophe, but that they had been betrayed by their leaders and the world in its aftermath. And that's the sort of thing that tends to make you a trifle resentful.
Right, so the Germans lost, which was a catastrophe, and they wound up feeling betrayed and resentful. How interesting, because Peterson is forever reminding his male followers about personal loss, life's catastrophes, betrayal, for example, by women who he hates, and resentment, which he asks his acolytes to consult. This is not a coincidence. When Peterson talks about how Germany was wronged and its young men brutalized, he's hoping that his army of dum-dums will consider how they've been wronged and brutalized. Put another way, he's banking on them identifying with the Nazis. This is why he often tells them that they are Nazis, emphasizing that if they don't understand that, they're naive.
Then, because that wasn't enough, in the 1920s, partly because of the reparation demands, the German currency hyperinflated to the point where it literally cost millions of marks to buy a loaf of bread. And what that meant was that anybody who was conscientious and diligent, who had saved anything whatsoever through the catastrophe of the First World War and in the aftermath, then lost absolutely everything they had. And then the 30s came with the Depression.
And what does this high school history lesson have to do with the question Peterson is supposed to be answering? It's giving him the opportunity to defend the country that would use its military defeat to justify another war and the Holocaust. And what motivated the Nazis during the Holocaust is the subject Peterson claims forms the basis of most of his work.
And while all that was going on, the Germans were terrified, and for good reason, that the communist revolution that tore apart Russia was going to be visited upon them.
And communism was the nemesis of Adolf Hitler, who equated it to Jewry and internationalism, a little like how Jordan Peterson rails against neo-Marxism, multiculturalism, and globalism.
So that's a lot of nasty things going on underneath the surface. And you can imagine that there was a fair bit of stored up resentment in the populace.
And resentment, be it toward women, educators, liberals, democratic politicians, members of the LGBTQ+ community, etc., is a feeling Peterson is attempting to elicit from his followers. He's trying to tap into the dark, primordial matter that resides within the collective unconscious. Or as Jung might have said, Peterson is hoping to embody the collective unconscious of impressionable, resentful, and badly educated men.
Okay, now enter Adolf Hitler, a man obsessed with the notion of will and with a certain degree of charisma and capacity for emotional communication, but also with a certain degree of capacity for dancing with and enticing the audience.
Hitler was a man obsessed with will, not a monster or mass murderer, but a man. The word man is reverential, as is saying that Hitler had charisma, a capacity for emotional communication, and so on. Of course, it's possible to say such things and not be a neo-Nazi. Historians do it all the time, but Peterson does it because he's a neo-Nazi. Also, he said that Hitler was good at dancing with and enticing the audience. He meant through speech, because he habitually says that Hitler was good at speaking. Now watch him telling his sycophants that they need to become good speakers, ones who are capable of dancing with their tongues.
The act of speech itself is extremely complicated. It's a very complicated motor activity, right? It's a very complicated action to dance with your tongue, let's say.
To become a good speaker, you need to learn to dance with your tongue, let's say. And Hitler, who was a good speaker, was effective at dancing with and enticing the audience, let's say. And why should Peterson's fans become good speakers? So they can become dangerous.
It is definitely the case that there is no more exceptional form of the capacity to be dangerous than to be articulate.
Hitler had the capacity for emotional communication, and Peterson's fans should develop the capacity to make themselves articulate, because that will make them dangerous. And is there anyone who might embody this dangerous articulation? Watch as Peterson identifies an aspirational model.
And certainly, the greatest people I've met, including great warriors, you might say, are great in no small part because they're articulate. I know a former special services, special operations soldier, Jocko Willink. Some of you might know about Jocko. He's got a pretty decent online following, and he's about 4 feet wide and about 3 feet thick, and he's one tough son of a bitch. I'll tell you, you don't want to mess with him, and he knows perfectly well and is very capable of articulating the fact that his success as a eminent warrior is in no small part dependent on his ability to communicate. Because he could communicate well, he could listen to the men who were under his command. Because he was articulate, he could explain to his superiors the situation on the ground. Because he was articulate, he could make a case that the men under his command who were deserving would be promoted. Because he could think in an articulate manner, he could plan strategically and not lose battles.
Peterson's followers need to learn how to speak like a great warrior on the battlefield, because, unbeknownst to them, he views them as potential conscripts for a neo-Nazi paramilitary organization, and that's because, long ago, he lost his marbles, which is to say, his aspirations are founded on the psychotic delusions that accompany his schizophrenia, the disorder he was diagnosed with while in hospital in Toronto in 2020. With that in mind, let's return to Peterson arguing that he's a positive influence on the millions of people who adore him by talking about Hitler's rhetorical skills, his resentment, and how he took revenge.
And so he spoke off the cuff. Now, what was Hitler aiming at? Well, certainly he was aiming at power. Certainly it appears that he was aiming at revenge, because he certainly took that, not only on the Jews and everyone else he persecuted, but on Europe itself, on his own people and the world, and he had his reasons for being resentful, and I'm certainly not justifying that. I'm just saying that they were there. And then he spoke to the audience, and he paid attention to what produced a reaction.
As Peterson did when he lied to Canadians by telling them that Bill C-16 would compel their speech, or when he argued that COVID mandates were draconian. Again and again, he tries to turn democratic citizens against democratic governments by eliciting resentment. He has described himself repeatedly as being on the front lines of the culture wars, rather strange given his tacit claim to be warning of the Holocaust Part 2. However, the contradiction dissolves when you realize that he hopes the culture wars become a kind of civil war. The chances of this happening may be low, but they're not zero, as any student of history should understand. But let's circle back to JP praising AH.
And so he could speak and listen, and now and then he said things that got a roar of approval from the mob. And he collected those in his imagination, because he was rewarded for doing so and willing to go where that mob spirit of collective resentment took him.
Again, it's all about resentment, the feeling Peterson is trying to summon from the Jungian depths in the hope that his brain-dead stooges will rise up and take revenge, like the Germans did.
And the consequence of that was all the catastrophes of the Nazi era. And so, yes, when I'm speaking to large audiences, I think about such things because I've thought about them deeply. And so, what's the danger? Well, the danger is that I'm in a position where in principle I could satiate my basest motivations with the approval of the crowd. And so what is to be done about that? And that's a very complicated question. When I was assessing what happened in Nazi Germany, what happened in the Stalinist Soviet Union, let's say, and in totalitarian states everywhere,
you will have noted how he alluded to what happened in Nazi Germany while failing to unpack what the Germans did in occupied Europe, for example, eradicate 2/3 of the continent's Jews. Furthermore, he's eager to highlight the supposed unfairness suffered by the Germans as a consequence of losing World War I, but he glosses over the war crimes they committed in World War II.
I was convinced by the arguments of people like Viktor Frankl and Alexander Solzhenitsyn that the fundamental sin of the totalitarian state was reliance on the lie. And so I decided, I believed that. I believe that it's the spirit of deceit that is identical to the spirit of tyranny.
He's not issuing a warning, he's giving instructions. You need to become a good speaker so you can lie and portray democracy as authoritarian so that people will feel resentful and take revenge, like Satan does in Milton's Paradise Lost, Peterson's favorite epic poem. And as Peterson writes in 12 Rules for Life, Satan represents the spirit of reason.
I actually believe that. And so I also believed that the idea that emerged after World War II, which was never again, was a good idea, but that we would repeat the same, we would produce the same hells unless we understood how we produced them to begin with and stopped doing it.
By produce the same hells, he means produce death camps like Auschwitz. He often likens Auschwitz to hell and tells his dupes that they could work as a guard there and enjoy it. He adds that he could work as a guard there and enjoy it, and that he has known this about himself since the age of 13. At the beginning of this video, you saw him scoff at being compared to a Nazi, but he compares himself to Nazis.
And my sense was those hells were produced through deceit. And so the way to stop that from happening is to not say things you think are untrue. And so 40 years ago, I decided that I was going to do my best not to say things I knew were lies.
Otherwise, he might have tried to help produce the second installment of the Holocaust. He forgot to mention that his vow to not say things that he knew to be lies came at the behest of a voice with eyes that appeared in his mind after he experienced a psychic split. this voice admonished him whenever he spoke by saying, "That's not true," and "You don't really believe that." He documents this, his descent into schizophrenia, in Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules for Life. In Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, he counsels people with odd experiences or beliefs to not tell a physician, warning that it takes very little to accrue a diagnosis of schizophrenia, which could stay on one's permanent record. He goes on to say that many people who have odd beliefs are in fact schizophrenic, but busy psychiatrists in public hospitals seldom have the time for excavation. In other words, psychiatrists are careless and prone to misdiagnosis. And when Peterson was diagnosed with schizophrenia, he and his daughter denied he had it, claiming he really had akathisia, an aggravating inability to remain still experienced by 24% of people who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Anyway, listen to Peterson admit that when he stopped saying things he knew to be lies, he did not necessarily begin to tell the truth.
And so 40 years ago, I decided that I was going to do my best not to say things I knew were lies. And that's slightly different than telling the truth, or maybe even substantially different, because who, after all, knows the truth?
The truth is, Peterson is a chronic liar who's driven to lie by his mental illness.
But we all know when we're telling a lie, and we could stop. And so I tried to stop. And the reason I tried to stop is because I became convinced that the pathway to hell was paved with lies. And I felt that it would be better not to go there and not to take other people along with me if I chose to go there.
Only he did choose to go there, and he's dragging his followers there by filling their heads up with lies, intolerance, and hate, by telling them he's there to rescue them, whereupon he promotes mystical and fascistic beliefs before handing them his enemies list and counseling them, as a clinical psychologist, to make it their enemies list. He's not a self-help guru, but a self-harm guru. He's a predator and a cult leader.
And so I'm hoping, by being very careful with what I say, that I'm not doing that.
He's hoping he's not leading his followers into hell. He's hoping perhaps a descent into Hades can be avoided if he speaks carefully, meaning cryptically. You see, he has to use analogies like the one about learning to speak like a great warrior, or what a crummy time the interwar years were for the Germans. He has to deny being a negative influence by praising Hitler before and after rejecting the notion that he's like Hitler. He has to employ crypto-fascism. Only his fans struggle with direct speech, let alone indirect or coded speech. My guess is that most of them don't have the foggiest idea what their hero is talking about. Anyhow, what evidence is there that Peterson is leading his supporters into a totalitarian hell?
And then you might say, well, what's the evidence? Because that's a good question. And I would say the evidence is, I've been at 400 of these events, you think?
Quite a few, yeah.
Somewhere between 300 and 400. They're all positive. Nothing negative has happened at any of them. Everybody who comes seems to be coming because they would like things to be better.
Hitler could have said that about Nuremberg rallies, which Peterson has gushed about.
You look on the right there, eh? That's the Nuremberg parade ground. So I hope you can see this a little bit. The left there, that's all people, right? So the Nazis built this parade ground in Nuremberg that was like the biggest parade ground ever built on the planet. And they'd have hundreds of thousands of people at these rallies, right? And so you look at the order. There's a line down the middle there where the leaders walk, and that's at Nuremberg. And then it's just surrounded by these masses and masses and masses of people in lines and all these orderly displays of power. And then there's Hitler there like this. And one of the things Hitler was really proud of was the fact that he could stand like that for like 8 hours. And that was willpower, as far as he was concerned. And he was a worshiper of willpower. And he bathed 4 times a day. So he's also somebody who was very much obsessed with cleanliness. Cleanliness and willpower and order. So that's Hitler.
Cleanliness, willpower, and order. That's Hitler. A resoundingly positive appraisal from the psychologist who commands his followers to clean their rooms, exhibit strength, and embrace order.
And that's what people say. People say when they talk to me, they don't come up to me and say, I've been following your advice and things were really bad 4 years ago and now they're way worse. They say the opposite. They say, I've been trying to take responsibility for my life. I've been trying to establish a permanent relationship. I've been trying to grow up. I've been trying to tell the truth. I've been trying to do a better job at work. I've been trying to make the proper sacrifices. I've been trying to set things straight with my family. I've been trying to clean up my room. And you know what? Things are way better than they were. And so the reason Tammy and I continue to do these lectures, to stay on the road so much, is because our experience has been that the events are extremely positive in every way. They're engaging and they're playful, and people are attentive and pleased to be there and generally quite well dressed, and they're looking pretty good, and it's a very positive and hopeful thing to do. And so I would say that not only do I worry about what might happen if I speak to a crowd, I would say I've done very little else in the last 30 years, 37 years, than worry about precisely that.
He worries about sounding like Hitler, but I don't think he should. It's unlikely that many of his followers or critics are familiar with Hitler's speech. My name is Troy Parfit. I'm the author of The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler. And if you enjoyed this video, please click like and subscribe, and please share.